Hey everybody, welcome back. And to start this off, I'm going to read some lyrics from the band Cake, and specifically their song Comfort Eagle. So I'm not going to play anything, I'm just going to play one note. Fancy. Production value. In that song Comfort Eagle, a part of it says, some people like Pepsi, some people like Coke. The wacky morning DJ says democracy's a joke. He says, do you believe in the one big song? He's now accepting callers who would like to sing along. He says, do you believe in the one true edge by fastening your safety belts and stepping towards the ledge? I make disparate connections with things in my mind, but I think that's pretty obvious in some ways of the kind of arguments that we can hear from kind of the beyond the middle of our political spectrum. What exactly that middle means is a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but I'm going to give it a shot and see if I can share a little bit about my experience as somebody who's researched these things for the last couple of decades, and hopefully something in here kind of resonates with you. First place I want to start is my context. I was raised in a Republican household. My relatives were Republicans, folks who'd served in the military, business people, educated folks. They were Republicans of the economic freedoms, military defense sort. They really weren't anything about moral principles as a foundation of policy other than a reverence for the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and the rule of law. My grandfather, pretty influential on my politics in the long run, because he had served in many public service capacities, served in the military for a long time, was Surgeon General of the Air Force, and had a lot of interactions with a lot of senior folks, and had respect for both Democrats and Republicans. Throughout the time that I knew him, and he spoke well of folks from both parties. He was a policy guy, had a lot of surprising positions given the era. My parents weren't so much into international affairs, but they were business owners. That's how I grew up, is kind of that kind of environment of people should be free to do what they wish to do as responsible adults within reason. The government should stay out of business and economics and should focus on national security of the United States. Where were we at that time? It's somewhat hard to tell. Ideologically speaking, I think that the United States has always been somewhat of a right-leaning country. It certainly has had some changes over the past several decades. I personally kind of reevaluated where I was in terms of political ideology the more that I studied it, and learning about how democracy works in different countries around the world, which was part of my training, and doing quantitative statistical testing of various theories about voting and democracy and so forth, and speaking to a lot of people who had a lot of involvement, including on the ground folks who had been election observers in various Eastern European countries, people that advised Eastern European leaders on transitioning democracy and bringing in free market capitalism and all these sorts of things. Really kind of made me much more aware of the complexity of these things and the interconnection of relationships amongst business people, military folks, politicians, in and out of office, even authors, musicians, all sorts of people that interact to produce change both within countries and between them. To my way of thinking, it's a lot more complex than what we often see boiled down for us into very simplistic and black and white kinds of chunks. Today, obviously, the situation is even more complex than it once was. Exponentially more information and uber faster flows of that information that can be really scary and confusing to a lot of people, including myself. The last political video, I talked about misinformation and disinformation and things like that, and avoiding being captured up by that. Difficult situations for sure. What I want to talk about first is this idea. Oh, and by the way, I prepared some pretty amazing visual aids here, so I hope y'all are impressed. So this is the old idea of what politics might play out like in elections. And this is the median voter theorem. And essentially what this suggests is you have this distribution of folks on a left to right kind of scale. And the biggest group of people is therefore kind of in that middle part. And therefore, you should, if you're a politician, position yourself in such a way as to appeal to those voters that are in the middle. And that, the country might take a little move to the right a little bit and might move to the left a little bit, and that politicians should then, position themselves in what they say and do and the people they visit with somewhere here in the middle, but not too far off. And for many decades, this sort of held up in many elections. This is what people used to think would determine the outcome of elections. However, the thinking now is more like you have a distribution like this, where you might have, here's a more left-leaning view of things. Here's kind of a kind of left, but not quite. Here's a moderate view. Here's a more right-wing view, and here's perhaps a more extreme right-wing view. And that these different groups of people, this doesn't allow you to really have a median voter, or at worst, or at best, you've got to capture some of these people, but you can move over and capture more of others. This is kind of a interesting way of looking at distributions of voters and how those things play out, and how those coalitions of groups can influence how parties act and the policies that they promulgate and the things that they talk about and the people that they go see and visit. And another thing to mention is really that, this conventional view of left and right, it doesn't really capture everything that's going on. People prioritize a lot more than just a single political ideology, but, they're likely to switch if somebody else appeals to them. So it's kind of a mess. It's difficult for political parties to necessarily nail down where they want to be in a distribution like that. Much more difficult. Now, how have parties responded to some of these challenges? Because there's only so much money to go around. I know that we constantly talk about money in politics, but we actually spend a lot more money on things like Halloween candy than we do on elections. Now, maybe that's a reassuring thing to you, and it probably should be. But there's limited funds, is what I'm saying, to do the kind of advertising and footwork necessary to really get their messages out in a way that's effective that way. They want sure things. They want to produce winners. They want districts that are safe for them, and you've probably heard these terms. And so they turn to a variety of tools like gerrymandering. So let's consider this unmolested district here, where you have a couple districts where this is pretty even, right? This is pretty even. This is probably maybe a win for whoever the red party is. This one's probably a win for the blue one, but it's hard to say, or the clear. But it's sort of a mess. And so if a party has to concentrate their efforts in, all four of these, because you could win, maybe you flip some people around. But let's say, and I didn't exactly draw this quite the way I would want to, but let's say that you change the boundaries of those districts and then you produce 1, 2, 3 of those districts are now relatively safe for whoever the red is. There's one district, this fourth one, is relatively safe for this clear party. So, these are things that happen through negotiations with amongst the party officials. They're not necessarily things that can be legally challenged all the time, so long as they can show in some way that they've done it in good faith. The dominant party, of course, is the one who creates the boundaries and then sets these things up. Now, having safe seats sounds great and all of that, but what it does is they tend to choose the areas with the most reliable voters, people who always turn up and vote. And generally speaking, those people usually have more inflexible and more ideologically pure kinds of beliefs about their particular party. And frankly, I'm not talking about one particular party or another, although right now, a majority of U.S. states are led by Republican governors and Republican legislatures. So at this point, you see Republicans often attempting, at least, to do this sort of gerrymandering. However, Democrats have done it in the past, many times. When they had dominant control over state legislatures and governorships and things like that, they would do this just as much. It's really a problem, and it's very short-sighted to ignore it, in my opinion, because at some point, the tables are going to flip. And so it's a really great idea to really try to solve that problem. I'll talk about that later. The next thing that happens is that you really don't want people who are kind of like, well, I vote. I vote sometimes. Maybe I don't vote in the primary elections, but I'll vote in the general as long as I'm not too busy. That kind of thing. You don't want people who are kind of like, I voted for the Democrats last time, but I think the Republicans I kind of like this one person, and I think I'm going to vote for them this time. You don't want those people voting if you are unsure of capturing your victory. And so voter suppression comes into play. And here's another fine example of my drawing skills. So let's just say, you've got some kind of ideal level of voter turnout. Let's just say it's 80%. 20% of people are like, man, I was sick that day. My car broke down. I just couldn't get out of work in time, whatever it happens to be. Let's say that 80% of people vote, which hasn't actually happened in a general election in this country for a long time. But at any rate, how can we constrain it so that only the most fervent of our supporters, how do you do that? Well, if you make people show IDs, or register ahead of time and show their ID, that can knock it down some. At least in the capacity of potential, just adding an element of inconvenience for some and others, an element of fear. Like, there are people who have no legitimate reason to be afraid, who are like, why do they want to see my ID? Cutting down the number of polling places. Oh, it's inefficient to have so many polling places and we can just concentrate them. Or, oh, we don't have the resources to cover those, so we need to get rid of some of them, and so forth. I can't quite read my handwriting. What did I write there? Oh, negative campaigning. They bombard a district or area or state or the country. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Blasting the character of the other person or saying salacious things and all that sort of stuff. And what that does is that drives people who are just like, I'm disgusted with this. And you hear those messages enough and you're like, I don't really care who gets elected. It doesn't matter. That can be a something that comes into your mind. Other things, again, gerrymandering, by creating districts where it's like, if I'm of the opposing party and I'm in a district that I know has been gerrymandered, why should I even bother to go vote? My vote doesn't matter. Mis and disinformation are out there, which can create confusion and bring it to a point where you're like, I don't think it really matters. Like the wacky morning DJ, democracy's a joke. Also, anti-mail-in voting campaigns, I think, are another one. Questioning the authenticity of poll workers and things like that. Efforts to constrain people from doing mail-in voting, which is very safe and very effective by pretty much every single bit of information that I've ever seen. But all of those things, what they do is they force turnout down. You lose those voters who are kind of like, yeah, I'd like to participate if it's not too inconvenient for me. People who work for a living and have to make an effort to get to a polling place, only to find that, the place that I thought I was going to vote is not that anymore. And so you've again kind of concentrated that pool of people who are voting to only the people that are reliable and probably the most fervent supporters and who are unlikely to switch votes, as unlikely as they can be. People still switch votes, even so. All of that kind of conspires to create situations which are really not good for democracy. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but this is from a guy in political science circles, is known by his acronym BDM. He is a pretty famous dude and has done a lot of really interesting stuff. He kind of resurrected this idea about 20 years ago of Selectorate Theory. And what that suggests is that when we're over here in a functioning democracy, we have a big old blob of all of our voters, all of our citizens, and then we have a group of people who actually participate in the election or legally are allowed to do so. And then during an election, we have this smaller group, which is basically the party or parties, because multi-party democracy happens in pretty much every country in the world except ours. And these are the people who won the election. So in this country, if the Democrats win the election, they have the winning coalition. If the Republicans win, they have the winning coalition. And then the rest of the people go out here into the Selectorate. They're along for the ride now. And then within that, you have a small core group of leadership. Now, if we get over here and we have a very small Selectorate, and then we have a leadership group or small group winning coalition within that, the smaller this gets, the more you are becoming an authoritarian country. So now we aren't legally constraining things to the point where this is the case, but anything that works to drive voter turnout down, in my way of thinking, kind of is leading us that way, where the majority of people end up not voting or whose votes are for the opposite party and therefore they don't win, the losing party. And that's troubling. Well, a guy, he was from Lithuania, he's a political scientist named Przorsky, and he said that democracy is a system where parties lose elections and transfer power peacefully. And I think that's an important point, because in many countries around the world, and you can just turn on the news and watch BBC World and see that that doesn't always happen and often doesn't. And in these countries where you've constrained that group to a small group, you have a large group of disaffected people who are either completely ambivalent about the workings of democracy at all, or are lethargic about their participation in society of that sort, or are actively hostile towards the society as a whole. That's not good. You don't want that. And I think in some ways, through these various tools that I talked about earlier and strategies, we're not there, but the constraints that they're placing on the number of people that can vote or will vote or believe they should or believe they can is troubling. It's foolish for any party, no matter how competitive they are or not, to ignore that. And I'll get to why in a little bit later. But so here's another guy. This guy was kind of an economist and kind of a political scientist, World War II veteran and everything. But he talked about how, and his name was Dahl, right? So he talked about how you have this kind of dimensionality on two dimensions, one being laws that allow for political contest. The higher that is, the more it ends up kind of governing what kind of country you can have. Now down here on the bottom, we've got rights. So rights that let people vote and also let people run for public office. And so if you're kind of maxed out on these two things, well, then you end up over here in what he calls polyarchy, which is essentially democracy. And there are lots of examples of countries like this where the rights that allow people to run for office and also to vote are quite effective and enshrined and protected. And they also have regular, very legally based, structured, and protected elections. Those countries are places like the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, the United States. Senegal is one that has a pretty good record on that front. A lot of other countries that we think of as consolidated democracies. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Spain, Italy. Yeah, so that's where you kind of end up if you have these two dimensions kind of maxed out. Now, let's say that you have laws that allow for political contests. You have elections at a variety of levels, but the rights that let people run for and vote for things are not so much. So over here in this competitive oligarchy situation, and those would be countries like Iran and Russia, where you do have elections. And Iran is a fascinating case of a managed democracy in that they have a parliament, they elect a prime minister, they have a lot of active local level elections for a variety of things, but they have this governing unelected body. They choose who can vote, and they choose amongst, like, you have to go file some paperwork, and they're like, yep, you can run for office after you've passed a series of tests that are political and religious in nature. But if you don't pass those tests, then you can't run for office. Russia is a sort of a different situation in that has ended up through a series of legal changes to their electoral system when perhaps in the early 90s they might have become a democracy, where nowadays they are not in any way, shape, or form. But they continue to have elections so that people have this sense of that they're participating, and they can say they're participating, but in reality, down here, they really can't. They really can't participate in political life in any meaningful way, especially if they disagree with what the government and the ruling party has to say. You end up in prison if you do that. You've got another situation where if laws that allow for political contests are not really well enshrined or non-existent, and you have very few rights to go out and vote or participate. Those are things like Saudi Arabia, North Korea, etc. I don't know that this quadrant over here, this inclusive, I always mispronounce this, hegemonies. That's it. I got it. I don't know this. Maybe somebody can throw something in the comments and explain their argument there, but I couldn't think of any of them off the top of my head. Where we are now, and this is not just our situation. I mean, when you look at a lot of European countries, Finland, Sweden, all the countries over there are experiencing this in one way or another, is that they're all having that complexity problem that I mentioned earlier too, where they have all this information and they can't sort it out, and it comes at you at a breakneck pace because we all have apps on our phones and all the things that we see all the time, along with mis and disinformation, either from internal sources or from externally, that really creates a lot of confusion about things. When things are scary and confusing, people like to hear from people who say that it's not. That speaks a little bit to the the one true song or the one true edge and give me a call and you can sing along with it, a line from that song. These things are dangerous, and when you look at this situation where in many ways people are being excluded from the process in this country and elsewhere, although I'm going to say, it's not a revolutionary situation right now, but could it get there at some point? It might. And revolutions are generally violent, destructive, followed by spirals of vengeance that can last decades. Corruption tends to be a huge problem. Poverty, economic performance goes through the floor when you have revolutions, especially violent ones. Revolutionary change can have a lot of appeal in that, if only we could just change these fundamental things, then it would all be different. In practice, threading that needle through to a peaceful resolution of those things is often incredibly difficult. That's why I really see incremental change through legal means and nonviolence to the degree that can at all be possible. That's not always possible. The revolution in Ukraine, for instance, involved protesters who violently resisted the efforts of the then government to crush them in 2014. That's why I didn't mention it before, because there was violence inherent in that to some degree once they responded, because they were getting the hell beat out of them and shot and jailed and everything else. Incremental, legally driven change in our system is something that it's unappealing to a lot of people because we get very passionate about a lot of issues, and believe me, I have many passions about some political issues too. I really tend to look at policies, not large-scale ideologies or isms, as driving what I try to advocate for as a citizen. What are the collections of policies that particular individuals advocate for, or that their party suggests that would address various problems and all these sorts of things? And knowing too that there is no single policy position or single thing that, even if you enacted it exactly perfectly, that is going to make everyone happy. Democracy is a system in which compromise is absolutely necessary. If people feel like they're not going to be part of the game or don't have another chance at some later point, things can get out of hand and we can go down those revolutionary paths. Just because we're a democracy now doesn't mean that we have to be in the future. If we don't maintain civic respect for our institutions and laws, as flawed as they are, as flawed as the people are that sometimes lead us, if people don't agree that this is the system and right or wrong, we're going to stick it out and just work within it to try to make things better, then we're in real trouble. That said, we've been a country that has experienced these kinds of things for the entire time we've been a country. And we see that grassroots efforts that attempt nonviolence, that's not always possible. The state sometimes responds violently to these things. And advocacy, support of political candidates are the pathway to real change. All sorts of things that arise from a grassroots effort of people just like me and you and everybody else we know that can participate in a political system by voting, by advocating for things that may make voting easier or more effective or more competitive. Giving some money, if you got some dough, to throw towards the candidates of your preference, that's a great thing. In many states, there have been efforts to create nonpartisan electoral commissions. My own state, here in Nebraska, the legislature had passed a bill that would have established a nonpartisan electoral commission, and the then governor vetoed that. And what that would do is prevent this from becoming that. Establishing a nonpartisan way to divide up those districts after each census would really be a great thing. There's a couple other states that do have nonpartisan electoral commissions, and it's certainly a movement that I encourage everybody to check out and see what you think. There are also voting rights organizations of many kinds. Civic Nebraska is one that I have a lot of respect for, and the League of Women Voters, which is an entirely bipartisan effort that really looks at things like gerrymandering and voting rights and communicate. I have always written letters to politicians for many, many years at all different levels. And generally speaking, in the past, they used to write me back. My letters have always been very respectful and policy oriented. Like, here's my policy concerns. I would get, maybe a quarter of them would write me back. That has become less frequent, and interactions online I see increasing constraints on your ability to communicate with politicians online because of trolls and all the people get on there and just attack for one reason or another. To the degree you can, your local representatives, they have offices. You can still write them, and they may write you back. They do see it, and at least their staffers see it and compile those sorts of things. That kind of thing is what civic democracy is all about, is participation. Protest is another way that if you feel like that's a thing, there are legal ways to register and have protests, and I think those are absolutely necessary with many issues. Oh, I finally wrote down, I kind of keep my notes off to the side there, take care of yourself. I mentioned this in the last video. We're headed into a difficult time. It's gonna be rough. Watch out for that stuff and limit your exposure to the degree that you can. Keep up with the issues and study the things that you need to learn about what you're voting for or whom you're voting for. But if you need to take a break and you feel your blood pressure, going through the roof, or you're strained and scared or anything like that, take a break, turn that stuff off, delete the apps off your phone, don't watch the news for a little bit, and just take a chill, man, and take a break for a couple of weeks. Another thing that I've done in the past is mute people on various social media channels that are always posting vitriolic, meme-based sorts of things. Just mute them for a while, they'll never know, and you can kind of just take a breath and not be so wrapped up in all of that. I hope this video has been helpful. I know these are difficult things to talk about and think about, and I certainly don't claim to be some sort of great authority on them. I have some experience, some authority from an academic standpoint. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I appreciate that you took time out of your day to watch this. Likes, shares, comments are always welcome. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. Thank you. Have a great day.